Welcome back to Property Now, where we are on a mission to make you the property pro in your group chat. Today, me and the guys are tackling a pretty big topic. We are trying to answer the question, is property gendered? We look at some recent data and statistics, we share some personal stories, and it's a really, really good conversation. Make sure you are following and subscribe so that you never miss out on Property Now. All right, guys. So today we are going to talk about the topic of property and gender, and we're going to try and tackle the big question, is property gendered? Now, this topic actually came to us from one of our listeners, Mel. So thank you, Mel, for the suggestion. So let's go straight into it. I think this is going to be a good one. Chris, I want to start with you. In episode 2, so if you haven't listened to that, go listen. We talked about how your parents' guidance influenced you to get into property at a pretty young age, I would say. Reflecting on your upbringing, how did your parents and maybe other adults play a part as well? How did your parents shape your perspectives on property ownership? And do you think that had anything to do with your gender or gender in general?
Thanks, Az. It's great to be back. I think it's a really interesting topic. And a big shout out to our probably super fan, our biggest listener, Mel. She's been listening for 4 whole episodes.
Since day one.
Since episode 1. Yeah.
And she's our biggest fan.
She's an OG.
Wow.
She's one of the thousands of fans that listen to the show. She's also my sister.
Go Mel.
But it's really interesting, right? Because myself, my brother, and my sister, so there's 3 of us, 3 siblings growing up. And, Daniel's older. I'm the youngest out of the 3 siblings. And my sister's the oldest. And, I having a chat with her, she was never pushed or never had the ambition to buy property until, my brother and myself really dug in and brought property and were pushed, I suppose. I don't know if it was pushed by the parents to buy property, but I think because we were working with Dad so often on property and job sites, and I think that's where we had the love for property come in. And then really my sister started wanting to buy property after myself and Daniel really got into property. So I don't know if there was ever a really big push from my parents for my sister to buy property. And to this day, she messaged us after one of the episodes to say, I think it was the traveling, when we were talking about traveling and saving up for a deposit. It was never really an ambition for Mel to save up and purchase property. Mel was big on traveling and liked to go overseas. And, there was never that inkling to want to purchase property as much as it was with us blokes wanting to buy property.
I'd be interested to dig deeper. I wish Mel was here with us because it'd be good to ask. Because, look, there's 2 parts to the question. Is it because she wasn't pushed or because there wasn't the same ambition? Because I think that's 2 very different questions. Like, your parents could push her to buy property and she might prefer to travel. Or they could have pushed her to buy property like you and your brother, and she could have bought property. So we don't know how that would have went down. So I'd love to know if her ambition came after seeing you guys doing it and saying, hey, Mum and Dad, why didn't you push me to do this as well? Because I really want to. Or if the ambition was the same as for you and your brother.
I think the ambition was different.
Yep.
I don't know if she had the ambition to want to buy property straight out. It could be a cultural. There's massive cultural elements, which we're going to dig in on the cultural side of things. There could be the cultural side of things. Back in the 70s and 80s, my mum was, her full-time job, and it's a full-time job, was raising us and the siblings, so wasn't working until we probably got to, I was in primary school, being the youngest. Then Mum started to do some part-time work. So maybe growing up with, that single income family. You talk about that with the Simpsons side of things, with Homer being a single income.
Yeah, they've got a great house for a single income family.
Yeah.
But the single income family side of things, so maybe Mel growing up seeing Dad as the primary income earner, therefore thinking that it's the male responsibility to purchase property and build the family home and buy the family home. I don't know if that's got an impact on...
Yeah.
We take for granted maybe that the dual income family is quite a modern thing. It's only quite new that my wife and I both need to work, you know what I mean? As opposed to, one can stay at home and look after the family. There's those gender roles are changing, and that's quite a new thing. right? So, and I think maybe Zaz, you might. I'm guessing you've got some stats as to how things are changing in terms of gender.
I sure do. So I did a little bit of research into this because, obviously it's great to speak from our personal experiences and like how we grew up and how we spoke about property with our parents or what we learnt from them. A couple of little bits I read. So there was a CoreLogic report came out in March this year, which was a little while ago now. My God, we're in November. But it is the most recent research from CoreLogic on women in property. So like Michael was saying, the trend is shifting. Women exclusively own 26.8% of properties in Australia. So that means like on their own, like they're the sole owner, while men own 29.9%. And then the rest is like a mix of joint ownership. Yep. So that is increasing. Women are growing. That rate, I mean, I was like, what does 26.8% even equate to in numbers? I can't even put a number to it. But the gap is shortening. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, women take longer to save for a house deposit, 9.4 years compared to 8.3 years for men, which I think makes sense. Women would take career gaps often, not all women, but, to have children might go back into part-time employment instead of full-time employment. So it can take longer to save up for a deposit.
Is that a pay gap issue as well, potentially?
Yeah, that was another thing. Women also face challenges due to a gender pay gap of 13.3. Now, do not come for me if that is not the most accurate statistic, but that's what CoreLogic tells me.
13.3% difference.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think it was really interesting when Mel brought the topic up to me. It's feedback on the show, and I love hearing this side of things. But I went over to Jason, went over to you, Zaz, and went over to Michael, and it turns out there's some similar traits between different groups. Went out to even some other team members as well. There's some similar discussions that have happened in other households. Like, Mark, you were telling me about your story with your brother.
Oh, well, my brother and I purchased property together, and that was something that was embedded in us early. I don't know if those same conversations happened for my sister. Now, granted, my sister got married quite early, so then she and her partner purchased a property together. But I don't know if there was ever a discussion about, hey, Jess, you need to buy something, and be self-sufficient and independent. I don't know if those discussions happen. And I spoke to my wife about it as well, because she grew up in a household with 2 sisters, 3 girls. I said, did your parents ever speak to you about property? And she said, no, never. Later on, they did, but not as they were growing up and teenagers and growing into adulthood. I think their parents discussed more like saving, the importance of saving to them. So like Tina was a great saver. And her sisters are good savers. But there was never like a property discussion, until we got together and we started talking about buying our first home together. Jace, you might have similar stories as well.
For me, I don't have any siblings, but in terms of seeing the family friends and cousins and so forth around me, I think for myself, my experience is more cultural, is that, come from a Chinese background, is that there's that sort of expectation that the male, when you get married, is the one that's going to provide the housing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a lot of the parents would be more concerned or push their son to start looking into this, right? As opposed to, their daughter, because the priorities and the urgency is quite different. So there's that pressure that you have to provide. So when you get married with someone, you've got to have a property, and that's very true. Overseas in China, is that they have a real issue now that for all these bachelors out there, if you don't have a house, it's very difficult to find a partner, because there's a massive expectation that you got to provide the house when you get married, right? So, and because of the property prices going up unbelievably, right? Even compared to here, it's so expensive to afford a house. It's pretty much unaffordable. That's why people who can't get a house through generational wealth or help from their parents find it very difficult to find a partner. So you got all these sort of trickle down problems,
pressure.
Right?
Yeah,
100%.
It's a lot of pressure. That's sad.
So that's where I think culturally there's a lot of priority placed on the sons to make sure that, hey, you have to have a house, or this is what we're going to do to help you buy a house, or you should start saving early, and property is at the foremost front of mind.
And what's interesting is it's hard to, I mean, you can speak from a mortgage perspective, you know, I'm actually surprised that the figures are like almost like more than a quarter of home buyers are single women, more than a quarter of home buyers are single men, because that's pretty decent considering like it's probably easier to service a mortgage with two incomes, for example, right? And there's probably other factors at play, like I'd love to break down that 26 and 27%, right? But we don't have those details. But I think what's interesting too is seeing that that single women are buying more apartments, and there's probably a reason for that. Like it's probably cheaper to buy an apartment, easier to buy an apartment, and we're seeing that in the figures, which is really interesting too, because for any single male or female to buy like a $2 million house, for example, it's not
the necessity.
Not feasible.
I mean, to buy a house or even for a single male or single female, what is the purpose of having, you know, excessive land? High maintenance property. You know, is there a point to want to go mow the lawns? You know, if you don't have children or if you're just a single person moving into a property, is there a need to have that higher maintenance property? Exactly. Maybe the apartment side of things is the lower maintenance option.
Yeah, and I think it was saying, like, another piece, it was in the Daily Telegraph, this one was a bit more recent, but it was talking about how women, you know, are much more likely compared to men, if they're buying on their own, to buy in areas that have like better amenities, also like more affluent suburbs. Yep. Which I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, eastern suburbs was a big one for single women.
Yeah. But yeah, they're purchasing in pricier markets, women that are buying on their own. So they've got good taste, I guess. I don't know.
But it's interesting because my wife came from one of 5 children and she's got 4 brothers. And the brothers buying property as well. When I came into the family, they were all buying property, very interested in the property side of things. So again, I think pushed as well. But you talked on saving. Bianca was a fantastic saver as well.
Where did
not necessarily? I mean, we met young as well, but not necessarily wanting to buy property. But she was a great saver.
Yeah. Where did B sit in terms of like age with her siblings?
Yeah, so she was the 4th child.
So she was towards the end, but still. So was it the younger brother interested in property?
He still hasn't purchased property.
Okay, so that could be an age thing as well. Yeah. Maybe the older siblings. Yeah, it's just so interesting, and I wish we had more of a cross section. Like we've got some like European, Middle Eastern, and Chinese families here. I'd love to have. I mean, Zaz, what was your household like in terms of?
I've got a lot of brothers. Yeah. I've got 5 brothers and 1 little sister, and I'm the 3rd youngest. So. Yep. Well, if you can keep up with that, 4 brothers older than me. And I think my parents, like, it's interesting because I think I said on a previous episode, my parents, my dad and my mum and I never spoke about property, never kind of emphasized the importance of like saving. And I started working pretty young, like, you know, just fun, casual job. So I could have been saving from the age of, you know, 13, and God, I wish I was, because I'd be in a pretty different position now. But my dad has a, you know, extensive career background as a property developer. So it's kind of always been in my family. So I often think, like, I wonder why we never spoke about it.
Have you asked
Because I think
your
I could have. No, actually, Dad.
If you're watching, listening.
Yeah, I actually haven't told him about the podcast.
I think he's our second biggest fan after Mel. Yeah.
No. But no, I do think about that. I think like they definitely, savings was not a thing that we spoke about in general. Money was meant to be spent on fun experiences or doing things for the people in your life to, you know, show them you care and show them you love them. I think they more would sort of influence me to pursue education. That was a big thing that they, always spoke about being really important. So, you know, I've done my undergrad and doing my master's, and I've always loved learning. So I've kind of always, that's where I've poured all my attention, and that's what they push me towards. Or big career things as well, you know, they're always like pushing me, go for that, try that. Property was just never one. And, you know, I don't know if my brothers had a different experience. A lot of the elder ones do own property, but, you know, they're married with kids. They're in a different age and stage of their life compared to me. My younger siblings don't and don't have an interest. So I think it's you know, in my family, whether you're male or female, it seems to be everyone sort of had the same experience.
one thing we spoke about trends changing, you know, and like the gender roles in the household changing, and that being a relatively new thing. And I think another thing that's changing is the way we speak to our kids about these sort of things, because I'm assuming maybe if one day you have kids, you might speak to them about finance and saving and property, for example.
Time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I didn't have.
I don't know how I'm going to do it because I don't know, but I'll work it out.
My parents spoke to me about, you need to buy a house because we're Italian and that's what you do when you like whatever. And that's important. And they spoke about these things, and saving was important, and they did speak about these things, but we never went into like detail of like, hey, this is why we do this, and you know, when you buy your house, you should do that. There was never detail about that. And for me already, like I'm already having conversations with my 5 and 7 year old about, you know, these sorts of things. And they're not incredibly detailed because they're 5 and 7, but we're starting conversations and I'm seeing interest from them as well.
The important thing with the 5 and 7 year old, boy and a girl.
Yep.
From your perspective, do you treat them differently?
No. Yeah.
The property side.
When the question came up from Mel, I was like, oh wow, I never really thought about this, and I have a son and a daughter, and I've never treated them differently. But it goes back to.
But then your brothers and sisters were treated differently. Potentially.
But it goes back to ambition from them as well. And I'm not saying that boys are going to be boys and girls are going to be girls. Like there's differences, but there's similarities, and there's individual differences as well. It's not just gender based. But I'll speak to my kids about things like we'll play games, like we'll be driving somewhere and we'll play like, hey, would you buy that house? You know, we do that a lot. And it's like, yeah, I buy this house. And they love like architecturally designed, rendered with a bit of brick facade. Like they love all the same types of houses. So it's actually really fun. And they're like, Dad, why would you buy this old grandma house? I'm like, because look at the block. Like we can knock it down and build something. You know, so we have those conversations. And my daughter, she's a couple of years older, so she asks more questions. So she'll say things like, oh, well, Dad, how much does this house cost? And I'd say, oh, it's $2 million, for example. And then she'll ask, do we have $2 million? And I'm like, why are you asking that question? And she'll say, oh, I just want to know if we could buy that house. So then I'm explaining like, look, you don't actually need $2 million. You can have a deposit and borrow that. And I'm starting to explain this to her. She's like, oh, okay, I get it. So she's starting to have an interest and an understanding without going into too much detail because she's 7.
So maybe it comes back down to interest, because and I'm not going to speak on behalf of Mel, but I don't think the interest may have been there for property initially.
Well,
until we started getting very interested in property and starting our property careers, then getting into it. And now Mel has purchased a property and she's got an investment for the last couple of years.
Good on you, Mel.
So that's really exciting to see that she's got into the property market since then. But does she regret? I mean, I think she said to me that she regrets not saving sooner and maybe going on those holidays. But she's got some great memories. But
exactly,
you know, it's worked out in the end well for her. But she's managed to get into the property market. But I talk on my children's experience. I've got 4 kids as well, primarily girls, and I don't even understand why to treat them different. I mean, if they show an interest in property, educate, of course, provide that education. Then again, if they didn't show that interest in property, maybe that's different. I don't want to push them into something that they may not want to do. It's very important to have the guidance to understand the importance of having the security of property.
I think, like, you know, I'm not a parent, but being able to like inspire that curiosity, and like it's not pushing them, but you know, speaking from my experience, like those little incidental conversations that Michael was talking about, like understand, you know, you don't need to explain like how do you buy a house to a 5-year-old like right now, but when you're driving past houses, when you see for sale signs, like I don't know what the answer is, but having those little conversations and just making them be curious.
You mean to make it fun. We do a similar game. We play hotels and we go past different houses and buildings, and we play how many levels is that building. And Madison is really interested. So my eldest daughter is really interested in that. My son, not so much. Yeah. So I think it's making sure that I don't have gender in my mind when I'm talking about property to my kids.
Yeah, like Chris, it's an interesting point you talk about. It's the interest, right? Using your sister as an example, and I think, you know, hearing what you guys are talking about, I noticed that many parents aren't doing things intentionally, right? For example, you and your brothers on the job site. So naturally, right, you get more exposure, right, to the property, and it may not necessarily be that your sister's not interested, but the amount of sort of exposure she's getting is not interesting enough for her to be interested or curious, right? And I think sometimes that's the difference, is that nobody is sitting down with their kids, for example, when they finish uni, and explaining to them, hey, this is option 1, you can save up and buy a property. This is option 2, you can also, which is also a great option, you can use your money and get some great memories and you can travel. There's nothing wrong with either of them, right? But this is what happens after you choose 1 or 2.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? So just make sure you understand. Does that make sense? Great. You make a intentional decision.
I love how you treat that like a mortgage broker. Like you have this conversation,
I'm
like,
like,
okay, kids, you
so
finished
smart.
school, now it's time to have this conversation. But I think there's 2 things, right? As parents, we need to create those opportunities for discussion. And you know, our parents may have never done that really for us, because it's not like we don't need to talk to the kids about money. Like this is stressful and blah, 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 blah. But by having fun and playing games, we open up an opportunity for discussion. And then if more questions come, we can find out what they're interested in. And I think that's important, because if all of a sudden our kids finish school and we're like, okay, kids, here's the rules about property, they're going to go, shut up, Dad. Like, I'm not going to listen to you because I'm a teenager. And I'll listen to you in 10 years.
I think the exposure point, Jace, was a really, really good one, because we were very much exposed to property physically. And, you know, part of that role, Dad being a plumber, was we would go to a job site and see a house being renovated or see an apartment being renovated. So then that got us into the mind of, okay, hold on. So there's an old building, you know, as kids, and I'm talking we were 10, 11 years old, during school holidays and whatnot. So as kids, going to see that, okay, people actually buy a property, it's old, and they renovate it, and that creates value. So that's that exposure part, I think, was really interesting for us to see firsthand from the property side of things. And both Daniel and I were on the job site, and Mel didn't have interest, obviously, to come into the job site side of things at the time.
Yeah, and Chris, that's exactly right, because that'll also create a lot of topics of conversation as well. You know, if you're surrounded by people that's involved in property and so forth, you're naturally going to be curious, and you're going to be able to ask people the questions that you're curious about, right? And then the more you get, the more interested you may become, right? Which will lead you down that path. Whereas, you know, if you're not getting that exposure, it's pretty difficult, you know, to have that interest or that curiosity inspired further for you to want to do something about it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. You know, like I don't think, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't imagine a kid just all of a sudden waking up one day and being like, I want to know more about property. You know, like I think all these little interactions or encounters you have day to day inspire that curiosity.
They become more curious.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the reason why we play hotels is because we stayed in a hotel for a wedding a couple of months back, and Madison was fascinated with the hotel and the design. It was very different to our house. And then for 3 or 4 months, even till now, she's saying, I want to be a hotel builder. So like it's really, she's got this interest in property, in design. So, you know, again, it comes back to the interest. And if they're interested in it, then you provide more exposure.
The next Hilton family.
Maybe.
The other interesting thing too is, right, like we're talking about the conversations with our parents and our kids, but the other one is who we surround ourselves with, so our friends. So growing up, I've, you know, went to school, close group of mates, we still all talk now, and property was always a big part, property investing, it's always a big part of our discussions, our WhatsApp chats, our barbecue chats, from when we were like in high school. You know, when we were 18, 19, we're having conversations about, hey, what if we all put in $100,000 and we bought a farm out in Tamworth, and what would that be worth in 10 years? And we'd have conversations like that, right? And we never bought that farm.
I could see Michael picking the tomatoes.
Why does every guy group in high school want to start a commune? I don't know. Anyways.
But the question is, were our female friends having the same conversations with their friends, right? And I, again, speaking to my wife, I'm like, did your mates, and she's got a group of friends from high school that she still speaks to today. I'm like, did you guys ever talk about property? She goes, no. Now we do, because we're selling houses and buying and whatever, because we're for our families. But there was never conversation about that before. So I'm interested to see, like, I know I've had those convos with my mates. I'm guessing you have.
Yeah, we did.
I'm guessing you have.
Oh, not at all. I mean,
you didn't?
What, in high school?
Well, like, do you talk to your mates about property?
Oh, only, for example, you know, later on when we're much older. Definitely not in high school. So you never had
those conversations young?
Mate, I didn't even know anything about property myself, you know, in high school, even during uni, right? It's... it's more around doing what I do now and getting into the industry.
Wow.
That it's a topic of conversation, or people around me have purchased an investment property. I mean, that example is really good, because I find that, or even with some of our customers, they're interested in purchasing investment property because they heard that their friends have bought a property. Right now, that's piqued their interest, right? Oh, look, they've bought a property. Maybe this is something I should look into, right? Because when people have done it, they usually promote how good it is, right? So,
I don't remember Mike talking about it at high school. I think my interest came from the renovation side of things. So we wanted to buy an old house in a location, want to renovate it. And that's probably the core side of our upbringing, being on job sites and wanting to renovate a property and add value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I think for me, the interest really peaked when I understood or learnt about what you could do with property, that it's no longer you just buy a property to live in. You know, for example, you can buy a property to invest, you can save on tax, you can build a granny flat, you can generate income in your sleep, right? Having someone else manage it. You know, that's where it became really interesting, that there's all these different ways that you could grow your wealth, you could create an income through property.
Talking on the wealth factor, I think when I was purchasing property, I didn't fully understand the exact wealth creation that it would create.
Yeah, right.
Again, you know, bought the property for $295. It's worth, call it $1 million now. At the time, and even looking at it now, I think, wow, that's some. I haven't done all that much in terms of increasing in the value.
If you knew,
right?
you would have bought 5.
I would have bought 5, right, at the time. I wouldn't have been able to afford it, but I would have tried.
100%.
But you don't understand at the time that wealth creation element of when you're buying that property that is going to create such wealth.
Yeah, totally agree.
Maybe
totally
our parents
agree.
understood that, coming through the 70s and 80s and seeing the growth, you know, if they're purchasing property for $15 back in the day, or, you know,
15 bananas.
10, 20 grand, 15 bananas. You know, and they saw that, call it 50 grand. That house that they purchased for 50 grand is now worth 400,000 at the time.
Yeah.
They've seen the value creation that it's added.
Yeah.
And then they've seen that we have a slight interest in property, and they'll push us and guide us in that direction.
Beauty of hindsight too, right? We didn't know back then. If someone told you, that's going to be worth $1 million,
Never.
Crazy. How is that possible? Like, this is expensive.
I would have genuinely thought they're crazy.
Yeah.
So it's hard. In hindsight, it's great to look back and go, yeah, I should have bought 5. I wish I could have somehow done that.
Yeah.
But we don't know.
Well, the interesting part of that is, I mean, when I purchased, it was, you know, for that previous 6 or 7 years, the property prices hadn't moved all that much.
Yeah.
But then, you know, come back to now, 11 or 12 years later, and it's, 3 times the value?
Yeah.
People don't realise that, and this is probably going off topic now, but everyone goes, oh yeah, property values, what is it? They double every 10 years.
Yeah.
But a lot of the move, it doesn't mean it's consistently moving up over that 10-year period.
Yeah, that's
nothing
right.
may happen for most of that time, and then you get a period like what we saw in the last 18 months where all of a sudden it's like 25% uplift. So, you know, it's that's why it's so hard to time these things.
It is. Like, you often see on realestate.com.au the sale history of the property, and it'll be like someone bought it for this price, then sold it for a loss, and then 2 years later the next person sold it and made $300,000, right? You know, and that previous owner had held it for like 5 years and nothing's happened. It's gone backwards, and then someone new.
It gives them a bad taste because they're like, oh no, property, it's bullshit, this doesn't work. So then you know what I mean, it gives them a bad taste from that experience. So it's tricky. What were we talking about? Gender.
You did say you're going off topic.
Way off topic. Bringing it back,
do.
my property refers to itself as they, them. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. I'm getting cancelled.
Cut that, PJ.
I'm getting cancelled.
Cut that. Michael, what you were saying about, not just your adults being influences in your, you know, property journey, property conversations, friends too. And I actually just yesterday crowdsourced some data from my high school girlfriends. And I was saying to Michael afterwards, it was super interesting because my friends and I have never spoken about property. And I've known these girls, some of them like 25 years, like, you know, we're 28 now. So it's been most of my life. And we have never had a conversation about property. A couple of them own property, but more often than not, we don't. I think maybe out of 13 or 14 of us, maybe 3 own property. But no, so I asked them, you know, growing up, and some of them have brothers, some of them have sisters, some of them are only children. I asked them, what was your experience growing up around property? Did you talk about it with your parents? And were you interested in it? And do you own property now? And are you looking to own property in the future? And they had some great stuff to say. I want to read a few of them. So this was from one of my girlfriends. My parents never placed too much focus on it, being owning property. And particularly as years go on, they even joke that you guys will never be able to afford a house in Sydney.
That's lovely.
And then,
Okay, boomer, yeah.
yeah. Then she said they realised that saving for a house means missing out on rich life experiences like travel, which they believe gives life more meaning than owning a house at my age. So no, I don't own property and I'm not saving for one. And this friend in particular, her parents are a lot more interested in investing in the stock market. So she's very interested in that, and they taught her a lot about that. But she, has been on some of the most incredible holidays and had some of the most amazing experiences. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. Another one of my girlfriends said, my parents didn't teach me about finances. And this was one that kind of came up a lot from my girlfriends, that they didn't speak about it because maybe their parents weren't the savviest business people, or didn't have a finance background, or didn't, have a property background. One of them said, I have never had a conversation with my dad about money. It doesn't feel natural to talk about it with him. And I think, that's makes me think about, you guys having these conversations with your daughters, and it's like, well, maybe they are curious, and you need to find ways to like inspire that curiosity and bring it out of them. I'll just read one last one. There's so many. I'm like, they're all so good. It was always drilled into me that buying property was the Australian dream. And until recently, I thought I would. My mindset has shifted due to changing priorities and how crazy the market is. Now I can't see myself buying, at least not for a while. My parents have a very different view on renting. They see it as wasted money, while I view it as a means to live where I choose. There hasn't been specific pressure from my parents, just the general expectation of this is what adults do.
Wow, that's deep.
Yeah, there's a lot to take in there.
Yeah, so I know I just like threw that all at you. But
so do you think Zaz, parents need to be doing more, or or focusing on the interest that kids have? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess it's tough, right? Everyone's just doing their best. And again, I'm not a parent, but I think you don't want to sort of feel like you're pushing your kid, like, so, you're an avid property investor, Jace. Like, you don't want to push it on your kids to follow the exact same path. But at the same time, being able to like use what you learn, use what you're passionate about and share that with them. And like you guys have said, if you see that sort of interest and you play with that curiosity and you kind of.
Yeah, well, I love the parents that, they're not into property, but they're into shares. So they taught their kids about that. And that's great too. That's great.
Yeah.
Like, so, as long as they're having conversations, but it sounds like a lot of those conversations weren't being had. And there's
that
so
was
much,
the common
so much to unpack.
trend.
The biggest thing to unpack is that, like, so you said at the start, this is the first time your group of girls have had a conversation about this in 25 years.
Yeah.
So if at the very least this topic has opened up that conversation for maybe a few of you to start maybe talking about it and maybe make some decisions.
Oh, it was so cool. I said to them afterwards, this was just on, Facebook Messenger, and I was like, thank you so much, guys. Like, I feel like I learned so much about like them and it was such an interesting combo. I hope they think the same.
Let's encourage others that are watching and listening to start a conversation in your WhatsApp groups, because even if it can be uncomfortable to speak to your parents, especially your age, our age, not everyone has had that. Your friend said it was unnatural to speak to her dad about money, or the other one that said that because I think that that generation probably doesn't understand that renting is probably an integral part of the journey now, whereas back in the day it was rent money is dead money. But now people are rent vesting, or they're renting before they before they could go from home to their own home. So maybe like your generation needs to teach their parents that maybe there's a way that rent money isn't always dead money. So that's
perhaps they just want different experiences. Like,
true.
My parents didn't travel, and they probably sacrificed purchasing a property with traveling. So they didn't travel because they had a property, they had a business my dad had his plumbing business to run. So they weren't able to travel. So when my sister showed an interest in traveling, they were happy to support that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And if that's what she wanted to do, they were happy to support it. They were sad that she was going away for 6 or 7 weeks at a time and they weren't able to see her. But she's got different experiences than, as we know, I haven't travelled as extensively as my sister, but she's got different experiences to what I have. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I actually like the fact of, like, if you can't talk to your parents about finances and property, I think it's important to be able to talk to someone about it. And someone that's potentially, that you're not paying, like a financial advisor. It's good to just, and not to take advice, but it's just good to hear other people's stories and what they've done. I mean, that's probably the basis of this show, right?
Yeah.
It's to talk on our stories and what we've done. No advice, but just to talk on what we've done and how we've done it, and that this isn't the only way. There's other ways to do it.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really good point. Yeah, just what you're talking about around talking to other people, not necessarily parents. What I find is, I think we talked about this, that there's so much information available now. Yeah. For example, I'm seeing on Reddit all the time, under the subreddits of property and finance, that people sharing their stories, asking questions. There are questions like, am I ever going to be able to buy a property? Should I buy a property or should I go traveling? The same sort of topics, and people are very willing to share their stories and what their experiences have been.
Well, you do this day in, day out as a broker. You have conversations day in, day out. So things that are very obvious to you, or that you've just have been drummed into your mind from the conversations, are not as obvious to other people. And we don't realise that. We've recorded, this is our 4th episode of this podcast, and there have been topics that we've discussed that for us is just like, it was just part of our story, where people are like, you know what, I didn't know you could do that. We take it for granted as well. So having the conversations, whether it's with your kids, your mates, even your parents, is super important.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because you're learning about the things that you didn't know was possible, right? So you don't know what you don't know. Yeah. Right? So that's why, having that conversation is really going to open up your mind.
Zaz, do you think your group of girls will have this? Is this just the start, or will you guys never talk about property again?
No, I think it's the start. Like, it's cool. I think even a few of my girlfriends, I'd say probably like 50-50 were like, no, I'm not interested in buying property and I'm not saving for one. But they're interested in investing, or they're interested in, watching the markets and how things, move in our economy. So I think that we all have that curiosity, no matter whether they own an investment property or they're buying a house or they're not interested and they're renting and living their best life, living in New York. Hi, Ems. That I think that, we will continue to talk about this. And I'm almost like, I feel like I've like cracked open, let's...
A massive topic.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know why. I don't know if it's because I don't know if it's gender related that we never spoke about this. I don't know if, my boyfriend or my brothers talk about property with their friends. I'd say probably not. Like, yeah, I think it's more just, I don't know whether it's just, not, maybe not thinking that this is something that you talk about with your friends. Maybe you think that this is just something you speak to the pros about or you work out on your own. It's not really something that you crowdsource.
That could be true, Zaz, because it could be the tall poppy thing, right? Is that you might want to open up a topic of conversation. For example, you own 2 properties, right? Yeah. And then you got to be sensitive to, say, the friends that don't own anything. Are you talking about this because you want to tell us how many properties you've got or your journey, this and that? Or maybe some people feel the other way, is that in this peer group, all of these people have owned properties, but I'm the one that doesn't own a property. So I don't want to bring up this topic, right?
We said it earlier, Jace. Yeah. Like, you got people that come to you, I'm buying an investment property because my friend's bought an investment property.
100%.
And that's the thing that I need to do to keep up with the Joneses.
Right. And that person probably wouldn't say to their friends, you guys bought a property. Yeah. What did you learn from it, right? But they're kind of hearing these conversations at gatherings. They're like, okay, I'm going to go away with this information, right? And do my own research in private. I don't, because it could be a vulnerable topic as well, right? Yeah, it's quite personal. Private
politics and religion.
Yeah, right.
You need to normalise having the discussion. Again, I think the bragging side of things, people might feel like you've got 20 properties that you're bragging about your property portfolio.
But sometimes you're not even intentionally bragging, right? Because sometimes you can't control how other people feel. You might just be talking facts, and you might want to be helpful to your friends that you've done something, you understood this is how I bought, say, the first and second property. You want to share that, right? And sometimes if you volunteer that, that might come across as, oh, nobody asked this guy to share this information, right?
There's a lot of those.
You know?
There's a
That's
lot
a
of
them
Cool
problem,
story.
Jace. Don't worry
Right?
about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, right. It's
There's a lot of those spruiker investors that like they bought 1 million properties in 5 minutes, and then they're like, you know what, this rental income's not enough. I'm now going to help people for a fee.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
So,
right.
so
like there's a lot of
I own 100 properties, and I'm going to start doing courses teaching
Correct,
people.
because I'm retired.
'cause
I don't need money.
But can you for a fee?
Yeah, please buy my course.
Yeah, please buy the course.
Yeah,
It's $1,000.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of that. That's where the conversation doesn't come up as easily, right? Because or for example, you might feel that you're prying too much,
Yeah.
right? Or someone who might not have owned a property, talking to someone who's owned a couple of properties, don't want to ask a lot of questions. Right, because that person might think, oh, you know, that's a bit invasive,
Yeah.
right? Because it's my personal stuff, right? So I think that's where the topic,
And I think the reason why I'm very keen to have an open discussion and
Yeah.
get people talking on property. When I purchased, I had my dad, my brother, Carol, who's a fantastic CBA financing advisor or mortgage
Yeah.
advisor, but that was about it.
yeah,
And I had, not much else around me to discuss the property side of things. So I'm a huge fan of people talking to other people, seeing what their experiences were, and then when they are at that point of looking to purchase, because buying property, it is a journey. It's not just something you decide to do overnight.
yeah,
When you're at that point of, hey, I'm ready to buy a property, then go out and seek that professional advice. Get your pest and building, Jace.
yeah,
Get your-
100%.
Get your legal
100%.
advice. If you need financial advice, get at that point.
Yeah,
Rather than going straight away, talk to everyone around you to see their experiences, to see, how someone's added value to
Yeah.
a property and see if that's for you.
that's right, Chris. And I think that's where online is so much better now,
Yeah.
right? Because it's anonymous, right? You can go online, Facebook pages, forums, Reddit, and you'll be able to read a lot of stories of what people have done. So that's really going to help you with preparing or how to think, what direction to take, and so forth, right? So there's just heaps of information out there.
I think we talk about it a lot, like, when you're at the start of your property journey or whatever stage you're at, building that support network around you. And like, I'm just thinking like, it doesn't have to just be a support network of the professionals, of the legal
100%.
financial experts. Obviously they are incredibly crucial in the process, but even just again, thinking about the convo I had with my girlfriends yesterday, like I felt invigorated by that to be like, oh wow, like this is where everyone's at with their property journey. This is what they think, these are the influences they had growing up. Even that is kind of like a motivation in itself, a driver to be like, this is why I want to get into property. And it doesn't have to just be the experts that you pay for their advice, often, not always.
Those convos with your friends could diversify opportunities for each other. So you might talk to your friend about property and she's then talking to you about shares.
Well, and I
right,
was like, wow,
Yeah.
that's great. I
Yeah,
hadn't
so
thought
you're like,
about
hold
that.
on a second, let me know more about that as well. Or hey, and on the other side of that too, if you want to go to Europe first, that's also incredible.
Highly recommend go to
highly
Europe,
recommend to go to
everyone.
Europe. And property's cheaper over there. Nah, in some parts, but don't do that. Not financial advice.
Yeah, have you looked at house prices in Lake Como? Amazing. Might buy a house in Lake Como. Who knows?
But coming back to the gender issue, what role do you think, and you mentioned this earlier in the pod, what role do you think the pay gap has? You talked about how long it takes to save, being another year and a couple of months extra for females to save as opposed to males. What role does that play?
Yeah, look, I think personally, my view is that I think when you're buying your first property, say in your 20s after university, and you worked in your first job for a couple of years, I don't think the gap is that obvious,
Yep.
at the entry level of your career. But I think as you get older and you settle down, especially when you have kids, I think that's where the difference starts to show up because of the responsibility of looking after the child. One person has to work part-time or not work. I think typically it's the female, right? And I think from that point onwards, you start to lose momentum in your career as well. So it's not just the period of time that you're taking off that you're not working, that there's a gap, but because you're losing momentum in your career and then the other person is building that momentum, right?
Yeah.
So when the person who's taken time off goes back to the workforce, they're already behind.
The career progression
Right.
impacts.
Yeah. So that makes a big difference. I mean, there's a lot of good things now that we're seeing in the corporate world where they're paying superannuation when you go on mat leave.
But maybe
excellent.
Maybe the goals have changed.
What do you mean?
So, and again, Zaz, you might talk on this, but as a young female, they might want to focus on the career side of things, building their career, and then they find a partner, they get married, they have a child, and maybe their goals shift. Maybe that career objective is no longer so important. And I know a lot of females out there that really focus on their career, which is fantastic. And I always have a big issue with the gender pay gap discussion because, you know, there's this fight for women to want to be equal to men. Well, I kind of say, well, why do you want to be equal? You should be aiming to not want to close the gap. You should be aiming to exceed the gap. You know, you shouldn't. Your benchmark isn't another male. Your benchmark is the best that you can be. Right. So I always have an issue with the pay gap side of things. And I personally, being an employer myself, I hate that discussion because I've never had someone walk in and say, "Oh no, you're a female. You're going to get paid less." Like that's not the right attitude to have. But I think maybe the goals shift as women get older and they have children in a relationship. You know, the career may not be as important as, you know, taking care of the kids if that's their responsibility in that relationship.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think, you know, again, like my poor girlfriends, I'm not naming anyone, it's fine. But, you know, a lot
Except
of them...
M's in New York.
Yeah. A lot of my girlfriends just talking on the, like, you know, getting married, wanting to have kids, wanting to settle down. A lot of my girlfriends are still single. You know, they're interested in, you know, maybe one day getting married, but they're not in a rush. And like they're, you know, really focusing on their careers and growth in that area. And the people that I do know that are having kids seem to be doing it like a lot later in life compared to, you know, my mum had 2 kids at my age now, and her mum before her had 2 kids at, you know, younger than me now. So I think, you know, it is those like shifting priorities, and at the stage that I'm at, I'm like, well, I can just have it all. And how naive is that? Because I'm sure everybody says that.
Yeah. But I think typically the gender pay gap is closing, but the definition of the pay gap as well, like we're seeing more homeless women over 55 now.
Fastest growing
cohort of homeless people is women over 55. And back in their day, you know, the career may not have been as important, right? Whereas now we're seeing career-focused young women, and we're seeing companies pay super during maternity leave and more opportunities, right? The pay periods during maternity leave and paternity leave are increasing as well, which is great. We're getting government support. I think that's all really, really positive. We're yet to see like the effect of a full generation going through to the end. Yeah. So that's why we're still seeing disparity, and unfortunately we're seeing comparisons, which I agree with Chris, like it shouldn't be about a pay gap. It should be about, you know, how can I get as much as I deserve or earn or, you know, how can I improve my skill set? But on the other side of that, there's also, it comes back to what we said about your sister at the start. What does she actually want? Does she want to travel or does she want to buy property? You know, and I speak to women, and my wife is one where she said to me that the year that she had with our firstborn was the best year of her life, right? So how do you take that away to go and like it's difficult. And the, you know, she didn't get that time with our secondborn because she had to go back to work a bit earlier, you know, because, you know, what have you. Yeah. But so I don't think we should be deterring men or women from having those experiences, whether it's traveling or having time off with kids, for just to work and buy 1 million properties. You know, there needs to be, and that probably needs to be part of these discussions as well with our parents, with our friends, with loved ones.
I think my point is, it's not, you know, if 20, 30 years ago, it was the responsibility of the man to provide. I think, you know, having 3 daughters, my message is it's everyone's responsibility 100%. To contribute. Yeah. And, you know, again, talking on the pay gap side of things, I don't want my girls to be fighting to be equal. I want them to be able to be who they're going to be and earn what they need to earn to get to that point and exceed, not just against a male's expectations, but their own expectations, most importantly. Yeah. I think that's what I want for my children.
100.
I love that. That is a beautiful note to maybe end on. Did anyone have any sort of final thoughts? What a topic.
Did we get to a conclusion? Is property gendered or not, or was it gendered and it no longer is?
I think that's the key, right?
It's slowly closing.
It probably was, and that's because of societal aspects. which are sort of being broken down now. It's always going to be fun to compare, and there's probably so many factors that we haven't even looked into. Like we're looking at raw numbers and data. There's probably so much more to dive into, and I'd love to bring in an expert who like can dive deeper into this, because I think we've just touched the surface of this topic, guys, to be honest with you.
Might be a
I'm
second
glad
episode.
I'm glad we can open up the topic and have a discussion. So, you're saying you've had a chat with your group of friends, your girls, HMs in New York.
That's the best thing to come out of this. If the only positive that comes out of this is
It's
that your
starting the
friends are
conversation.
talking about it, then that's incredible.
Yeah.
The intention of our discussions here on this show is to get the discussion happening outside of this, to become the expert in your group chat. So, I think what I like is that we're able to start the conversations, and, people like our super fan, Melinda, my sister at home, can then think for themselves and think about their own personal circumstances and even come back to us with feedback. That I love that.
Yes.
That's happened.
Yeah.
That's my final thought.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Well, is that everything, guys?
Yeah,
Happy?
absolutely.
Happy. Amazing. Until next week.
Until next
Thanks,
week.
Az.
See you next time.
See you next time. Thanks for listening to Property Now. If you had any thoughts on today's episode, or if you wanted to suggest a topic for what we will chat about next time, drop them in the comments. We would love to hear from you.